The last thing that we have to do inside of our contract is put together our finalize request function. Remember, this is what a manager will call in order to finalize a request, or in other words, get the request paid out to the vendor. In theory, a manager should only be able to call this after a request has gotten enough votes. Let's now flip over to Remix and start putting together this function. At the very bottom of our contract, I'll add on finalize request. I'm going to mark this as public, and I'm also going to add on the restricted modifier as well, because of course we only want our manager to call this. Whenever someone calls finalize request, they need to also specify which request they're trying to finalize, just as we did before inside of approve request. So as an argument, I'm going to say that this has to be called with some number that specifies the index of the request that the manager is trying to finalize. Then inside of here, we can start doing a couple of basic checks. The first thing that we'll want to check is to make sure that this request is not already marked as complete. So if we go up to the top where we have our struct definition, you'll recall that it has this complete flag right here. It's a Boolean that starts off as false. Whenever a request is finalized, we're going to mark it as being complete. And we're going to do that by flipping this field right here to true. And that's going to make sure that people are not able to approve the same request, finalize the same request multiple times. So after this thing goes to true, that's it, no more finalizing the request. So back down inside of our function, we'll add on require, and we're going to require that requests at index is complete. Now, specifically, we don't want it to be true right here. So again, we're going to add on the not right here to flip the Boolean from true to false. So if this thing right here is true, we want to flip that to false so that the require statement fails. Also, let's not forget to put our semicolon after that. Now, before we move on from the complete flag, we definitely want to make sure that we update the flag to be true after paying out this money to the recipient. So I'm going to make sure that right now I add in requests at index.complete is true. Already, we're seeing that we are reaching into the request mapping several times here. So again, I think that we'll create another local variable just like we did before. So right underneath the top of the function, I'll add on request equals requests at index. Don't forget to also add in the storage keyword right here, because we want to specifically say that this is a variable that should be looking at the same copy of the request that already exists inside of storage. One other thing, just as a quick reminder, remember that the capital R right here specifies that we are about to create a variable that is going to refer to a request struct. Then inside of here, we can update requests at index to be simply request, and requests at index to be simply request. We do have an error message right now. If you hover over it, you'll notice that we've got, oh, did I misspell unit? It should be uint. My mistake. Okay, so this looks good. Now the next thing we have to figure out is how we decide whether or not a request has gotten enough approvals. And that's something that we have actually not really discussed much at all. We have said that every request object has a approval count value right here, right? It's a unsigned integer, but we haven't really specified how many approvals the thing needs before it can be finalized. So I think that maybe a reasonable approach would be to say that at least 50% of all the people who have contributed to this campaign have to vote yes in order for this thing to be finalized. So I think that we need to add on another require statement that compares the number of approvals that this request has against the total number of people who have contributed to the campaign. Now the second part of that, getting the number of people who have contributed to the campaign, is actually kind of challenging. Remember, right now, our array, or excuse me, our contract has a approvers mapping, and we cannot do any type of iteration or summation or anything like that over this mapping. So if we want to get some count of the total number of people who exist inside this mapping, we have to actually create a second variable or another state variable to keep track of how many people have joined in this contract. So I'm going to decide to add in another state variable here. I'm going to make this an unsigned integer as well. We're going to call it approvers count, and we'll make it public as well. So now every single time someone donates to our campaign, we're going to increment the value of approvers count. I'm going to find the contribute function. Here it is right here. And after we add that person's address to our mapping, I'll increment the approvers count variable by saying approvers count plus plus, like so. So now we will always have access to this variable that tells us how many people have joined in or contributed to our contract. Now that we have this number, we can finish the voting logic or the finalize logic inside of finalize request. So inside of here, we'll add on one more require statement. We will require that request.approval count is greater than approvers count divided by 2, like so. So now if we have, say, 50 approvers who have, or 50 people who have contributed to our contract, at least 25 of those, or actually 26 because it's greater than as opposed to greater than or equal to, at least 26 people must approve a request before it can be released. Now the very last thing we have to do is to make sure that after we run all this logic, we're finally going to take the money that is specified inside the request and attempt to send it to the recipient. For that, we'll write out request.recipient. Remember, this is the address of the person that we want to send our money to. Because it is an address, it has a method called transfer. And we can call transfer and pass in the amount of money that we want to send. So then inside of here, the amount of money that we want to send is request.value. So remember, the struct that we are working with all along has the value property, and that specifies how much money we are trying to send. So we'll say request.value, like so. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. Now, the last thing we have to do is one more test of this contract. So let's take care of that in the next video. And then we can start thinking about actually deploying and building a real application in front of this contract. So let's take care of that in the next video.